This might just be my most clickbaity title yet for a YouTube video, but there is some truth in what I'm going to say, so stick around. I think it's going to bring you some value. Now, if you'll recall, recently I made a video touching on some of the comments that John McAfee or McAfee made, talking about how in 3 years he thought that the price of Bitcoin could reach upwards of $500,000 and how Ethereum could potentially reach a level around about $200,000 level as well. I offered my thoughts in a video about whether or not I thought that was realistic, whether it was possible or not, and I said that basically it could be if we get into a situation where we have some kind of hyperinflation. I mentioned what happened to Germany in the early part of the 20th century after World War I and the Treaty of Versailles and all that stuff. And after I made that initial comment and thought about it, I decided that night that I'd just kind of look into the whole situation again, because it's something that I was taught and learned about in school, but I haven't really revisited any time since then. And as I was doing that, I came across this graph. I'll bring it up on the screen now so you can see it, and what it's showing you is that from the years 1918 to 1923, which is significant for reasons I'll go into in a minute, the value of one gold mark, in contrast to one paper mark, rose from just 1-to-1 ratio almost in 1918 to a level where in 1923, one gold mark was worth, that's 1 trillion paper marks. I had to double check on Google. 12 noughts equals 1 trillion. And just right off the bat, I'd actually be quite interested to know how many of you know what's going on and why those dates are significant. I know that for me in the UK, pretty much, I think as with most of Europe, pretty much everyone learns about Germany in the 20th century for obvious reasons. And I'd be intrigued to know whether, because most of you are American from my YouTube demographics, I'd be interested to know if you guys know kind of in quite intimate detail about what actually happened to Germany in those events for that early part of the 20th century. So maybe let me know in the comment section down below about that. I don't have that information to go on right now, so assuming that it isn't something that's really taught in American schools so much, perhaps you didn't even know that hyperinflation occurred for Germany in the early 1920s. I'll give a kind of brief history lesson on it now. I had to go on Google last night and kind of double check my facts because it's quite a long time ago now since I studied it. And basically, after World War I, which occurred from 1914 to 1918, Germany, along with much of Europe, to be fair, much of the world, was flat out broke. The problem for Germany, though, is that as well as being broke, they also owed the Allied forces a bunch of money in the form of war repayments. Because when they surrendered and lost World War I in 1918, they signed something called the Treaty of Versailles, which was essentially an incredibly harsh and tough deal for the Germans and the German people. In fact, the German people were so outraged by it that they called the Weimar Republic and the German government at the time the November Criminals. And essentially what they agreed to is that they'd pay an enormous amount of money in the form of repayments to these countries. I think it equated to something like a third of the entire annual budget for the German government. Of course, that would be entirely unsustainable for any country. We have a tough time right now, our nations. We're just managing our own kind of national debt in peacetime is difficult enough, never mind owing an additional third of our budget to other countries all the time. And what made things even worse for Germany as well is that these repayments had to be paid in either the form of gold or foreign currencies. Germany had already depleted most of its gold holdings, and in fact it detached itself from the gold standard during the war as well because it was getting into so much debt. And so their only option was fiat paper, kind of the paper German mark. They had to try and use their national fiat currency to get hold of other foreign currencies in order to pay those war repayments. The problem was they just couldn't do it. Their economy was essentially broken, very poor country at the time, they couldn't afford it, and so they did what the only kind of thing they could really think of doing at that point, similar to what we do now. If you don't have the money to pay your debt, what do? You print money. And so throughout the 1920s, Germany just kept printing and printing as much of their national paper mark currency as they possibly could, and this had the, in hindsight now, inevitable effect of completely devaluing their currency. It was meaning that they'd have to print more and more and more of these paper marks just for the kind of value of whatever dollar or whatever they're using to pay these repayments. And the German people kind of noticed this, and it made them realize and question the value of the paper that they were holding and how they might want to trade it for other things that are actually more valuable. Which created just a terrible, terrible cycle, which led to terrible hyperinflation, which led to kind of pictures that you see on Google nowadays where people were just wheelbarrowing huge amounts of paper money around. And so I've just got some notes in front of me, some facts I made note of, displaying how quickly and how rapidly this occurred. Around the start of the war, let's say the years 1914 to 1916 or so, the value of the German paper mark to the dollar ratio was about 4 paper marks for every $1. That's not bad, you know, it's pretty stable. And then towards the end of the year, or after the war, when Treaty of Versailles was signed in 1919, that then escalated to the point where it was 48 paper marks for every $1. Pretty bad, but still not absolutely terrible. Come 1921, we're then at a point where it was 330 German paper marks for every $1. That's pretty much at the point now where that is, you know, it is pretty terrible. But that's nothing compared to what's about to happen as well. In 1922, just 1 year on from that, we're now getting to a point where people are sitting down with JP Morgan, kind of US investment banks, trying to sort this out. Completely failed. And so it got to a point then where the hyperinflation really began to kick in. And we're now at a point where 7,400 marks per US dollar. And then by November 1923, at the very kind of worst, most critical point of this German hyperinflation, a single US dollar could buy you 4.2 trillion German marks. So in the span of just less than 10 years, which again just shows how quickly these situations can escalate, the value of one US dollar in accordance with, you know, German marks went from 4.2 German marks to 4.2 trillion. So that's basically what happened to Germany back then, and I think the reason that's so valuable, why it's worth taking all those lessons from a century ago for that situation, is because so many things echo in a similar sort of way today. Developed countries like the US, UK, Canada, Japan, whoever, yes, we don't owe enormous amounts in the form of war repayments, but there are some similarities still between us and Germany back then. For a start, we've detached ourselves from the gold standard as well, except the only difference is that for us, we've done that for decades now, not just a handful of years, like was the case for Germany. And the other problem as well is that we also have enormous national and personal debt. If you look at deficits for, I know for the UK in particular, because that's the country I know best, because I live there, the size of our deficit over the past few years has just absolutely spiraled. And there's no real sign that that's going to change anytime soon either. And so it does lead to some of us feeling quite panicky and worrying about this. And then there are always some people who say, oh, you know, don't worry, we're the top countries in the world, will be fine. We warn about things like happening in Zimbabwe. I know that's kind of really popular example of hyperinflation. I think there was a similar type with Hungary as well. People disregard those because they're not such big economies or whatever. But again, here's a situation 100 years ago now where Germany, who was perhaps more significant then than even they are now, even though they're still an enormous world player on the world economic stage. This happened to them, and so I feel like if it could happen to them, it could certainly happen to us too. And now this is where Bitcoin enters the scene. So not just Bitcoin, but any cryptocurrencies. If you know much about cryptocurrencies, you'll know that at least with Bitcoin, there's a pretty much limited supply or limited cap of 21 million that are ever going to exist. And so long as these national governments with their fiat currencies just keep printing and printing and printing into oblivion, there's every single chance where we could end up in a similar situation to what we saw with Germany back then. And so again, to bring up that graph that I showed you at the very beginning of this video, where I'll bring it back up now, the value of one gold mark and compared to paper marks and how it went from the value of 1 to 1 trillion over a matter of 5 years. There's no reason why we couldn't end up seeing a similar graph a couple of years from now where the value of one Bitcoin ends up being worth something ridiculous like $1 billion or even $1 trillion US. I guess part of that will again depend on your own personal view about whether our current situation is redeemable or not. Some people think we're far too past it now, we're never going to pay off these debts. Sooner or later things are just going to kind of collapse. We're waiting for a 2008 2.0, if you will. And then there are others who aren't so concerned and think that this situation is just redeemable. We've just had a bad few years recovering after the 2008 crash. I have to say that I think personally I fall more in the former camp. And you just can't keep printing and printing money forever. It's just sooner or later it's going to come and bite you. And so that's why I'm more than happy to just keep putting my money into cryptocurrencies and precious metals like silver as well. I'm pretty much done with this video, that's all I had to say. Not only did you have a commentary on cryptocurrencies in this video, but you had a kind of mini history lesson as well. What do you think of the information that I presented in this video? Do you think the world situation today with our fiat currencies is in any way comparable to what happened in Germany in the early 20th century? And do you think it's realistic at all that we could actually be in a situation, maybe a couple of years from now, where one Bitcoin or one whatever other cryptocurrency you want to use could actually equate to an enormous amount of dollars or pounds or whatever fiat currency you want to use. Could we ever be in the situation where one Bitcoin could be worth $1 trillion? I can't wait to hear whatever thoughts and opinions you have to share on this. Be sure to let me know in the comment section down below. Give this video a like if you enjoyed it, and I'll be back with more videos very soon. Cheers.